Hey there. I'm so glad you're here. If you're ready to let go of today and drift into rest, you're in the right place. Take a breath, like and subscribe if you haven't yet. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The Ouija board under the bed. 2 years ago, my nana came home from a yard sale with something that made my stomach turn. A Ouija board. I've always believed in the paranormal, and it's fascinated me for as long as I can remember. But I've also known better than to mess with forces I don't understand. I've read too many stories and seen too many unsettling documentaries to consider that board a simple toy. Just the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. My nana, on the other hand, didn't believe in any of that. She thought it was just a silly game, something fun for me, my younger brother, and our 2 cousins to play around with. But I refused to touch it. I left it sitting on the dining room table for a few days, hoping she'd change her mind. When she told me to put it away, I slid it under my bed, intending to forget it existed. My brother and 12-year-old cousin constantly nagged me to let them play with it. They were relentless, pestering me with every spare moment, arguing that it was just for fun and nothing bad would happen. I tried to explain to them that it wasn't just a game, that the Ouija board wasn't something to take lightly, but they were preteen boys, naturally drawn to anything they were told not to do. One evening after work, I came home to find them both at the house, and immediately I had a bad feeling in my chest. I checked under my bed, and the board was still there, but something about it felt off, as if the air around it had changed. I walked downstairs and confronted them, and though they denied playing with it at first, I could see right through their expressions. Eventually they admitted it. They had used it. They insisted they had said goodbye when they finished, which is the proper way to close a session. But I didn't feel reassured. My cousin in particular was a dramatic storyteller, always exaggerating things for effect. So when he told me they'd heard odd noises and felt a strange chill in the room, I brushed it off as typical kid antics. They loved trying to spook each other and often prank one another, so I assumed this was just more of the same. A few nights later, I climbed into bed, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease. As I lay there, I suddenly had the intense feeling that I was being watched. I turned toward my closet and noticed one of the sliding doors slightly ajar. It revealed just a sliver of darkness beyond the crack, and it immediately unsettled me. I turned away from it, trying to ignore the growing dread and focus on falling asleep. At some point in the night, I finally drifted off, only to be woken abruptly by what felt like a sharp blow to the back of my head. I had been lying on my back, my head resting flat on the pillow, and yet something struck me, hard enough to jolt me awake and send a wave of panic rushing through my body. I sat up, trembling, heart racing, and looked around my room. Nothing was there, just shadows and silence. But then I heard it, creaking floorboards, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking around my bed. The sound circled me, steady and unmistakable. I didn't dare move. I lay frozen in place, my breath shallow, my entire body tense. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my phone, bolted from the room, and ran to the living room, trying to calm down. I curled up in a chair, still feeling that pulsing sensation on the back of my skull, as though the spot where I'd been struck was still reverberating. My phone's screen told me it was 3 a.m., that uncanny hour that always seems to magnify the fear of anything paranormal. I tried calling my boyfriend, now my husband, again and again. 15, maybe 20 times, but he didn't answer. I sat there with tears in my eyes, completely unnerved, until the soft rustle of morning stirred the house. My nana woke up around 6. I didn't tell her what had happened. I knew she wouldn't believe me. She'd laugh it off, call me dramatic, and go about her day like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't shake it. That morning, After breakfast, I finally got through to my boyfriend. He had his phone on silent overnight and felt terrible when he saw the missed calls. I told him everything. How I was attacked in my sleep. How I heard footsteps. How something felt terribly wrong in my room. He apologized over and over, saying he would have come over in a heartbeat if he had known. Later that day, we both agreed that the board had to go. We took it to a junkyard, tossed it in a dumpster, and left without looking back. That night, for the first time in days, I slept without fear. Whatever had been in the house, whatever had crept into my room, seemed to have vanished with the board. Looking back, I know it sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was real, too real to be imagination. The way my head stung, the sound of those slow steps circling my bed, the overwhelming dread. None of it was a dream, and what truly haunts me is how quickly it all ended once we got rid of the Ouija board. That object, whether you believe in spirits or not, holds something. It opens doors that shouldn't be opened. The fact that my cousins used it without knowing what they were doing makes it even worse. They could have invited anything into that room. I was just the unlucky one who experienced the consequences. Ever since that experience, I've warned anyone who would listen. Don't mess with a Ouija board. It doesn't matter if you think it's just a toy. It doesn't matter if you're skeptical or curious. Some things aren't meant to be questioned or provoked. You don't have to believe in spirits to suffer the effects of what these things can bring. My Nana meant no harm. She truly believed it was nothing more than a piece of wood with letters on it. But intention doesn't always protect you from consequence. That lesson came at the cost of my peace of mind. For a long time, even after throwing it away, I couldn't sleep with my closet doors ajar. It's strange how one seemingly small choice, a trip to a yard sale, a playful suggestion, can unravel into something that leaves a permanent scar on your memory. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't discovered that the board had been used, if I hadn't confronted my cousins, if I hadn't taken it seriously. Maybe things would have gotten worse. Maybe something would have stayed. I'm grateful we acted quickly. My boyfriend, now husband, was the only one who truly believed me and helped me see it through. He's the only person in my family who knows what happened that night. The house feels normal now. Calm. Safe. But sometimes, when the wind howls late at night, or when a floorboard creaks unexpectedly, my heart still skips a beat. And on those nights, I remember the icy hand of fear creeping along my spine, the sound of footsteps I couldn't see, and the weight of something unseen brushing against me in the dark. I know now that belief isn't required for the supernatural to find its way into your life. All it takes is one open door, and the mistake of not closing it in time. Story 2. The backyard skull, and the house that wanted use gone. When I was 10 years old, I had an experience that still lingers in my mind, like a cold shadow at the edge of memory. It happened at my Aunt Claire's house in a small town called Green Hill. The house she lived in was a modest 2-bedroom home, simple and unassuming on the outside, but it quickly became a place where strange occurrences slowly escalated into something far darker. At first it was small things. The occasional sound of footsteps when nobody was moving, doors creaking open by themselves, items being moved or vanishing, only to reappear somewhere they shouldn't be. Shadows flickered in the corners of your eyes, only to vanish when you looked directly at them. We tried to ignore it. We blamed the sounds on the house settling, the shadows on tricks of light, but then it got worse. I spent a lot of time at that house with my cousins, Tyler and Seb. We'd run around the backyard, climb trees, dig in the dirt, typical kids. One afternoon, for reasons I no longer remember, we decided to dig a hole in the farthest corner of the garden, right where the backyard met an old, rotten wooden fence. The fence separated the yard from a patch of forest and empty fields, overgrown and forgotten. It was the kind of place kids turned into imagined kingdoms. We dug with sticks and spades, laughing as we hit something hard beneath the earth. At first we thought we had struck buried treasure. But as we unearthed it, excitement turned to horror. What we found was a skull, small, white and weathered. We screamed, calling for my aunt and mother to come see. They tried to reassure us. They said it must have been someone's pet. A dog, maybe, but I remember the way their faces paled. Years later, I would learn the truth. It was the skull of a baby. My aunt had taken it to the police, but nothing came of it. No records, no answers, just silence. After that, things in the house shifted. Whatever peace or neutrality it had before was gone. On the night of the fireworks, a night meant to be filled with laughter and color, we all gathered in the living room. My aunt, my parents, her boyfriend, and the kids. Everyone was accounted for. That's why it was so strange when we heard heavy bootsteps walking across the floor upstairs. Slow, deliberate. Impossible. My aunt tried to brush it off, suggesting maybe it was echoes or neighbors, but then I passed the stairs to get into the kitchen and caught something in my peripheral vision. A large, dark figure swinging, suspended from the landing ceiling. I gasped, and when I turned, it was gone. My aunt's face drained of color when I told her. She didn't dismiss it. She just nodded, quiet and scared. I would learn later it was a common sight in that house. That night we stayed over, as we often did. As the boys and I lay in bed, laughter echoed through the hallway. Children's laughter. Light footsteps ran past the doors. We weren't laughing. We weren't playing. Then came scratching, soft at first, then louder, creeping up the walls. Every time we tried to trace it, it moved. Opposite walls, shifting corners. It never settled, like something playing with us. We tried to distract ourselves with a movie. Silence of the Lambs, of all things. It didn't help. Halfway through, my dad left to pick up takeout, and as the movie paused, a sudden, thunderous boom erupted from upstairs. We jumped to our feet, including the boys, now wide-eyed and startled. We ran upstairs to find nothing out of place, until Tyler pointed to something small and pale on the floor against the wall. My aunt picked it up and recoiled, nearly throwing it. It was a tiny baby shoe, white, with pink lace and dark stains blotched across the fabric. My aunt didn't have daughters, just 2 sons, 9 and 6 years old. Then my mother's voice broke the silence. "Claire, the attic's open." Her voice trembled. We looked up. The attic panel, which had been sealed shut with paint and a special sealant to prevent drafts, was now pushed aside. Open. The insulation exposed. Plastic bags glinting faintly in the shadows above. That attic had been professionally checked and closed before my aunt moved in. There were no reasons for it to open. No ladders, no strings, no wind. My aunt's boyfriend pulled down the opening and retrieved the bags. Inside were baby clothes. Tiny ones. Frilly dresses, small socks, more shoes. None of them belonged to my aunt or anyone in the house. That night, the adults decided to burn the clothes. The fire pit in the backyard glowed with strange energy as the items were reduced to ash. After that night, the house grew darker. A feeling settled over it like a cold fog. You couldn't go into a room without feeling watched. Sometimes it felt like someone was breathing behind your neck. My aunt tried to cope. She lit candles. She played music. But it didn't help. A year later, she finally packed up and moved her family out. She couldn't stay any longer. And it's a good thing she left when she did. 6 months after the house was sold, there was a fire. A man died in it. That death led my aunt to research the house's past. What she found chilled us all to the bone. She discovered that the house had a history of tragedy. Every family that lived there lost someone. One man hung himself on the landing, right where I'd seen the shadow. Another family died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Before that, a fire claimed a child and a pet. The deaths went back decades. She could only find so much. Records vanished or stopped. But the pattern was clear. The house was cursed, haunted, tainted by something malevolent, and we were lucky to have made it out. My aunt had been the first to escape unscathed, but the warning signs were always there. The laughter, the scratches, the figures, all of it had been leading to something worse. To this day, I can't go near that part of town without a deep, uneasy feeling twisting in my stomach. My ex-fiancé lives not far from the house, and whenever I drive past, I avoid looking directly at it, as if meeting its gaze would somehow call it back. Sometimes I wonder if the house remembers us, if it waits for the next family, if it watches them from the attic door, just as it watched me. Maybe it's just an old house with a tragic history. Or maybe some places don't forget. Maybe they feed. Maybe they grow stronger with each scream that echoes through their halls. I don't know. But I know what I saw. And I know what I felt. We never figured out whose baby those clothes belonged to, or why the attic had been sealed. We never found out if the skull in the backyard had nor a grave. The police never followed up. No answers. Just silence, and the overwhelming sense that something in that home didn't want to be discovered, and something else didn't want us to leave. I've carried this story with me for years, not because I want to scare anyone, but because I still dream about that attic, and the soft creak of boots on the floor above. Story 3. The cat, the church, and the tablecloth. When I was a child, there were very few things I feared more than cats. It wasn't the result of some past trauma or childhood injury. There had never been a bite or a scratch, no dark alley encounter or glowing eyes under my bed. My fear of cats was born from something quieter, avoidance. My mother didn't like them. She didn't want them around the house and never encouraged me to interact with them. That wariness grew into anxiety, and eventually into an irrational fear. Whenever a stray wandered too close to our driveway, I'd retreat into the house as if danger had come knocking. It was silly, I know, but fear doesn't need a reason. Sometimes it just takes root in silence. And then came Holly. She was my best friend through all of childhood, from 3rd grade to 8th. We had sleepovers nearly every weekend, ran barefoot through parks and markets, and wandered farther from home each year as our confidence bloomed. When we were 11 or 12, I slept over as usual. We stayed up too late watching scary movies, laughing about jokes we didn't fully understand. The next afternoon, her older brother Isaiah had a piano lesson at their church. Holly didn't want to be left behind, and I didn't want to be alone in the house, so we all piled into the minivan, her mother dropping us off before heading off on errands. Isaiah went in the main building. Holly and I, left to our own devices, ventured into the long grass outside the churchyard. There, among the weeds and wildflowers, sat a cat. Holly had told me about her before. An old grey cat named Bubbles that wandered into the field near the church searching for food or attention. Bubbles was the kind of cat you'd call weathered but wise. She didn't flinch or fuss when Holly clucked her tongue and held out her arms. The cat came willingly. She scooped her up, purring and soft, and carried her as we explored the field. I was nervous at first, but something about Bubbles, her calm demeanor, her lazy blinking, put me at ease. I petted her, cautiously at first, then more confidently. It felt like breaking a spell I hadn't even realized I was under. Boredom always catches up to children, and after a while, our attention shifted to a nearby building, technically church property, but usually unused. Holly said it was empty most days, except for a few upper rooms that held classes. The bottom floor, though, was often silent. No lights, no sounds. That mystery called to us. We entered cautiously, Bubbles still in Holly's arms, purring like she'd done this 100 times before. The air inside was heavy with dust. Sunlight filtered through shuttered windows in pale streaks, making every particle of air shimmer. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was thrilling, forbidden and secret. We tiptoed down the hallways, voices barely a whisper. Every door we passed seemed to lead nowhere. Empty rooms with stacked chairs or forgotten storage. Eventually, we stumbled into what looked like a banquet hall. Tables stretched across the room, long tablecloths pooling onto the floor like still water. 2 doors at the far end hinted at a kitchen beyond. We spoke in low giggles, marveling at our own daring. That's when we heard the slam. It echoed through the building, sudden and jarring. We froze, eyes wide, listening. Footsteps followed, uneven, stumbling. Slurred muttering crept down the hall. Someone was coming. Someone who didn't sound sober. The footsteps grew louder, closer. A man's voice, angry, incomprehensible, muttered something we couldn't understand. Holly's face went pale. She whispered that he was speaking her family's language, something Eastern European, maybe Russian. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that whoever this man was, he wasn't supposed to be here. Holly pulled me toward one of the banquet tables. Without a word, we crawled beneath it, pulling the heavy cloth down behind us. We held our breath, hearts pounding. Bubbles mewed once, softly, but quieted as soon as Holly stroked her fur. The man entered the room, still muttering. His steps were uneven. He bumped into tables, slumped against the walls. We couldn't see him from under the cloth, but we could hear everything. His breathing, his stumbling gait. He was angry about something. He didn't sound confused. He sounded like he was looking for something, or someone. We didn't move. We barely breathed. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed crouched beneath that table, waiting. Eventually the footsteps faded. He wandered off, his voice echoing down the hallway, growing fainter. When we were sure he was gone, Holly whispered for us to go. We slipped out from under the cloth and ran, not back the way we came, but around the building, out through a side door, and across the field. We didn't look back. We didn't say a word. Once we reached the spot where her mother had dropped us off, the normal world seemed to snap back into focus. The sky was blue again. The birds were singing. Everything felt too normal, too safe, like the danger we'd just escaped hadn't been real, but it was. And deep down, we both knew it. We never told anyone. We didn't want to admit we trespassed. We didn't want to get in trouble, but the memory of that moment, the trembling silence under the table, the sound of his boots on linoleum, the muffled muttering in a language I couldn't understand stayed with me, and so did Bubbles. That old grey cat became the first feel I ever truly loved. The fear I once had slowly faded, replaced by something gentler. But that day in the church with the cat and the tablecloth, it reminded me that fear doesn't always need a reason. Sometimes it walks the hallway, just out of sight, waiting to be heard. Story 4. The bus stop stranger with empty eyes. It happened during one of those in-between stages of the year, the time when the air is hot, but restless, and everything feels on edge without explanation. I lived in a quiet town, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever seems dangerous until it suddenly is. At the time, I was working at a small Japanese retail shop inside the local mall. The hours weren't great, but I liked my routine. I usually worked closing shifts, which meant I could sleep in, take my time preparing lunch, and catch the bus early enough to buy a snack before my long shift began. It was the kind of predictable comfort that makes the world feel safe, but some days don't follow the script. That morning started strangely. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed a commotion outside near the town hall. Several police cars and an ambulance raced by, sirens wailing, slicing through the calm of the day. I paused for a moment to watch, wondering what could have happened, but with work on my mind, I quickly brushed it off. I caught the first bus as usual and got off at the intersection, where I always waited for my second one, the one that took me straight to the mall. I stood in the small shelter, the sun blazing down, And then I saw him. He was already there, tall and thin, wearing a sweater that looked too heavy for the heat, and construction boots that seemed out of place. His backpack hung low on his back, stuffed and sagging. He had dark, empty eyes that didn't blink much and didn't look away. It took me a second to realize I recognized him. He was a regular at the store I worked at. He came in often to buy cheap earbuds, rarely speaking more than a few words. That familiarity didn't bring comfort. It made me more uneasy. I pretended to scroll through my phone, trying to shield myself behind the illusion of distraction. He walked over and sat beside me, still staring. I forced a polite smile and greeted him, my voice small. He told me he remembered me from the store and asked if I was headed to work. I nodded, not wanting to be rude, but also wanting to keep the conversation short. He began talking about his life, how he was having trouble with his parents, how he'd been kicked out, how he'd been couch surfing from friend to friend. There was a sadness to it, but also something that felt too practiced, too calculated. I told myself he was probably just lonely and awkward. Not everyone who seems strange is dangerous. When our bus arrived, we boarded together. He sat next to me, uninvited but insistent. The ride was long, and he talked most of the time about hobbies, music, random memories. I tried to be polite, nodding, responding when necessary, keeping my voice calm. He asked for my number as we stepped off the bus near the mall. Caught in a moment of confusion and perhaps foolish sympathy, I gave it to him. He smiled and said we should hang out sometime, maybe smoke and chill. I smiled weakly and hurried inside, the safety of work settling around me like armor. That night, he texted. I responded briefly, told him I was tired, that I had work early the next day. I hoped that would be the end of it. And for a while it was. Weeks passed. His number faded into my list of forgotten texts. But then the news began to spread. Something terrible had happened right near where I lived. An assault in broad daylight, just across from town hall. A teenage girl had been attacked by someone with a weapon. She survived, but barely. The community was shaken. It wasn't the kind of place where that happened. It didn't feel possible. And then the police released photos. A name, a face, and my heart dropped through the floor. It was him. The man from the bus stop. The man with the heavy backpack and the strange empty eyes. The man who had walked me to work. The man I had sat beside on the bus. I stared at the photo in disbelief, memories crashing back in fragments. His gaze, his voice, the way he never blinked. I checked my phone, scrolled through the dates of our messages, and matched them against the timeline in the news reports. They aligned perfectly. He had committed the assault hours before I met him at that bus stop. The thought made me sick. My body tensed with the weight of unprocessed fear. I hadn't just crossed paths with someone dangerous. I had shared space with him. I had spoken to him. He had my number. For days after, I barely slept, checking my windows, replaying the encounter over and over. What if I had said the wrong thing? What if I had rejected him more harshly? What if he had followed me? My thoughts spiraled endlessly, guilt mixing with horror, as if I should have somehow known. But how could I have? That's the part that stayed with me. The knowing afterward, the realization that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear heavy sweaters in the sun and carry backpacks full of things you'll never understand. I deleted his number, blocked everything. I never heard from him again, but I never truly stopped thinking about him either, not because of who he was, but because of who he could have been to me. A near miss, a quiet horror brushing too close to my life. It changed how I see people, not with paranoia, but with sharpened awareness. We move through the world assuming the strangers around us are harmless, that the scariest things will announce themselves, but evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes it sits beside you on a bench, Start small talk and smiles when you say you're tired, and sometimes all that separates you from tragedy is timing. A delayed bus, a distracted glance, or a moment of undeserved kindness that somehows you. Story 5. The man who delivered more than pizza. When I was in my early 20s, my life was tangled in a mess of loneliness, shame, and unhealthy coping mechanisms. I was struggling deeply with mental health issues, specifically binge eating. Nights were the hardest. They stretched on endlessly, silent and heavy, and I often tried to fill that silence with food, piles of it, ordered late, consumed quickly, and never really satisfying. It was during one of these quiet, desperate evenings that a seemingly insignificant moment unfolded, something that still lingers in the corners of my memory, like a shadow I never quite addressed. I had ordered pizza again, one of too many times that month, and the man who delivered it would mark the beginning of a very subtle and uncomfortable chapter. He was older than me, probably in his late 30s or early 40s, though I didn't pay much attention to him in that brief moment. We exchanged the usual pleasantries at the door. A thanks, maybe a compliment about my piercings or hair, but nothing that set off alarms. I was 20 at the time, deeply lost in my own head and self-worth. I closed the door behind him, pizza in hand, and thought little more of the exchange. But apparently he thought more of it than I had realized. Days later, I received a friend request on Facebook from someone I didn't immediately recognize. It took a moment, maybe longer, to piece it together. His name, his profile picture. It was the pizza delivery guy. What made it stranger was that it wasn't the next day or even the day after. He had waited a few days, which meant he either remembered my name from the order slip and searched for me later, or had written it down. That tiny detail hit differently. I hadn't given him my name directly. It wasn't like we'd chatted or connected in some meaningful way. He'd taken something intended for customer service and repurposed it into a window. At the time, I was in a very vulnerable place. I had few friends, and desperation can cloud judgment in ways that seem unfathomable later. I accepted the request. Almost immediately, he began leaving comments on my photos. The kind that tiptoe just over the line of inappropriate, too familiar, a bit too admiring, often tinged with sexual undertones. I didn't engage. I didn't respond. But I didn't block him either. Looking back, I realized I was afraid of the consequences of making him angry. I told myself it was harmless, that I was reading too much into it. After all, it had just been a pizza delivery. He didn't have power over me, right? But it didn't feel right. It felt like being watched, like my own loneliness had opened a door to something I didn't ask for and couldn't close. We never spoke directly after that. No private messages, just the occasional unwanted comment until, finally, I quietly removed him from my friends list. I didn't block him, didn't report him to the pizza place. I didn't even tell anyone about it. Hindsight paints a clearer picture. I should have done something more, but at the time I was floating through a fog of depression, numb to most things. This strange man, twice my age, had accessed my private life through a moment that should have ended at my doorstep, and while nothing physical happened, the emotional discomfort lingered long after he was gone. The part that unsettled me most was the realization that I had no idea who else he might have done this to. How many other girls had received a pizza, only to later see him pop up online, commenting on their pictures? How many of them were younger, more vulnerable? It's a quiet kind of threat, not awfully aggressive, but unsettling in its persistence. It made me look differently at the everyday interactions I once thought were safe. The person smiling at your door might be building a narrative in their head that you never intended to be part of. It wasn't just about him. It was about how my silence became part of the problem, about how easily someone can turn access into intrusion. I replayed that night often, wondering what made me so passive. Why didn't I set boundaries? Why didn't I call the store and tell them one of their employees was using delivery slips to stalk customers online? But I also forgave myself. Because when you're in pain, when you're lonely and worn down, you don't always think like yourself. You become someone quieter, someone who avoids confrontation, someone who minimizes their own discomfort because it feels easier than speaking up. Years have passed since that winter night, but the unease never fully left. Whenever I order food now, I use apps with minimal personal info. I check who's delivering, and I don't open the door until I see them walk away. It's not fear exactly, it's caution. A kind of quiet armor I've built over time. I've grown a lot since then. I'm stronger now, more sure of myself, more aware of boundaries and red flags, but that version of me, the lonely girl who just wanted comfort food and instead found herself being watched, still exists somewhere deep inside. Sometimes we think the scary stories only happen in the dark alleys or the empty parking lots, but often they happen in your own home, lit by soft lamps and television glow. They start with a knock on the door, a simple handoff, a moment you thought would end in 5 seconds. And sometimes, those are the moments that echo the longest, not because of what happened, but because of what could have happened if you hadn't quietly stepped away. Story 6. The clock that ran out at 4 a.m. There are stories passed down in my family, quiet stories, never spoken too loudly, often whispered in hallways or shared during late nights when no one else was listening. These stories revolve around what we call the visitors. Sometimes they come in dreams, sometimes they appear as shadows in the room. But more often than not, they arrive when someone is about to leave this world. I used to think it was just folklore, something made up to ease the fear of death. That was until I started noticing how often these strange goodbyes coincided with final breaths. And then, one story arrived that I still can't quite explain. A story that didn't happen to me directly, but to the son of someone my parents knew very well. He was 28, smart, well-traveled, the kind of person you'd never associate with anything paranormal. He was working abroad in Moscow, but had taken leave to visit home for his sister's wedding. Their house was full, guests sleeping in every spare room, the air electric with celebration. That night, everyone went to bed exhausted but content. Somewhere between midnight and morning, something changed. His Russian wife was the first to notice. He woke up around 12:30 a.m., panicked and sweating. His eyes were wide, darting across the room like they were following something the rest of them couldn't see. He was terrified, truly terrified, and he kept saying the same thing. They're coming at 4. His older brother rushed in, trying to calm him down. They assumed it was a bad dream, maybe a stress response, but he wouldn't settle. He asked for his mother. When she entered the room, he looked at her with pleading eyes and begged her to stay close. "They're coming," he whispered, "at 4. Please don't leave me." He refused to sleep. He clung to her hand and stared into the corner of the room like something was waiting there. His family began to worry. He wasn't someone who had breakdowns or anxiety attacks. This was different. This was primal fear, the kind that made the hairs on your arms rise without knowing why. Still, they tried to stay rational. Around 2 in the morning, they took him to a nearby hospital. The ER staff didn't know what to make of it. They ran a battery of tests, blood work, drug screens, ECGs. Everything came back clean. No substances, no cardiac issues, no neurological flags. "He's perfectly healthy," they said. "Maybe he's just overstressed." The doctors gave the family the option to take him home, but seeing how panicked he still was, they agreed to let him stay in a room at the facility until morning. It seemed the safest option. His mother stayed at his side, holding his hand through it all. Around 3:45 a.m., the room grew cold. Not just chilly, but unnaturally cold, like the heat had been pulled out of the air itself. The young man sat up in bed, eyes fixed on the far wall. He was crying, not from pain but from recognition. "They're here," he said softly. "So many of them, in white robes. Their faces are covered. They're angels. They're standing all around me. They've filled the room." His mother, frozen with fear, watched as he extended his hand toward the ceiling, as if reaching for something unseen. At exactly 4 a.m., his body went still. Just like that. No dramatic collapse, no struggle. He simply leaned back, exhaled, and stopped breathing. His mother screamed. Nurses rushed in. But it was too late. He had passed. The medical staff were stunned. He was young, strong, with no signs of illness. His death certificate would later list it as unexplained cardiac failure. But to those who were there, to those who heard what he said, who watched his face when he described what he saw, it was anything but ordinary. His story is the most vivid, the most documented in my memory, but it's far from the only one. My own grandfather claimed to see his parents standing by his bed 3 days before he died. He told my aunt the exact time he would pass, and he did, to the minute. My uncle once woke his wife in the middle of the night saying that his mother was calling to him from outside the house. He died just 20 minutes later. My own mother, in her final days, kept referring to the others in the room with us, people we couldn't see. She told us her parents had come to collect her. And they did, not long after. Some might call it hallucination, a byproduct of the brain winding down. But it always struck me how specific the times were, how consistent the experiences were across age, belief, and location, how the people involved always seemed eerily calm, as though they were not surprised by who had come to meet them. Maybe it's our way of understanding death, giving it form so it doesn't feel so unknown. Or maybe the veil between worlds truly does thin when our time approaches, and maybe those we've loved, or those tasked with escorting us, really do come to guide us across. The young man's death still echoes in his family's hearts, not because he was taken so young, but because he knew when it would happen. He saw them, and he was afraid not because he didn't believe, but because he did. That belief, I think, is what stirs something deep in all of us. Someone familiar, someone kind, or perhaps something we cannot name, something ancient, something beyond fear or warmth, simply present. I share this story not to frighten, but to remind that life is full of moments we don't understand, and death is not always the silence we expect. Sometimes it comes with a whisper, sometimes with a face, and sometimes with a promise, a time spoken hours before, a moment that arrives not a second too late. We may not know what waits for us on the other side, but those who've glimpsed it never forget. Story 7. The drummer who didn't know Maine. Back when I worked as a pizza delivery driver, I encountered all kinds of people. Families celebrating birthdays, college students pulling all-nighters, lonely souls needing something warm and fast. Most customers blurred together over time, their names and addresses dissolving into one big map in my head. But there was one man I could never forget. His name was Mike, and we simply called him Mike from around the corner. He was a regular, the kind of customer who always ordered the same thing, always paid in cash, and always answered the door in some state of disorder. But with Mike, things were never quite normal. Not once. Every time I delivered to Mike's place, the door was either cracked open or wide open entirely. Music blared from somewhere inside, usually the chaotic rhythm of drums. And there he was, completely consumed by the sound, pounding away at a drum kit with his headphones on, completely oblivious to the world. I'd have to knock multiple times, shout over the noise, or even step into the doorway just to get his attention. It became routine. Sometimes he wouldn't even hear me come in. I'd stand there, pizza in hand, waiting for him to notice. Once I left the pizza on the counter, scribbled a quick note, and walked out. There was one time I walked in and found him slumped over the coffee table, passed out cold, drool hanging from the corner of his mouth. I called out to him. Nothing. I nudged him gently. Still nothing. Concerned, I called the police, thinking he might have had some sort of medical emergency. They came quickly, and to my surprise he was fine. Groggy and confused, but fine. He barely even remembered I was there. The officers said he was extremely intoxicated, possibly on a combination of alcohol and pills, but nothing fatal. He mumbled a thank you as they left, then promptly sat back down at his drum kit, as if nothing had happened. Over time I learned that Mike wasn't just a little off. He was lost in something much deeper. He always seemed suspended in some personal haze, drifting through life like the soundtrack in his headphones was more real than the world around him. It was always late at night when he ordered. Always the same music. Always the same mess in the living room. Sometimes I wondered what his story was, what led someone to live like that, completely detached. But I never asked. I just did my job, handed him his food, and walked away. Months passed, and eventually I moved on from delivery. Got a new job, one that didn't involve knocking on strangers' doors or navigating late-night routes. I didn't think about Mike again until almost a year later. I was in line at a hardware store, waiting to buy paint for a weekend project. When I looked up and saw him, it was definitely him. Same face, same build, but cleaner. Sober, standing straight, dressed neatly. He was wearing a name tag and helping another customer find the right kind of screwdriver. I watched him for a moment, stunned. It was like seeing a ghost of someone still alive. When our eyes met, I gave him a small nod, half smile. Nothing overbearing, just a quiet acknowledgement, but he didn't react. No flicker of recognition, no awkward smile, nothing. He looked right through me like we'd never met before, like I hadn't walked into his house dozens of times, like I hadn't seen him half conscious on his living room floor. I stood there frozen, wondering if I should say something, but I didn't. I paid for my paint and walked out, my mind spinning the whole way home. That moment stuck with me more than all the others. Not the time he was passed out, not the endless drumming, but that silent dismissal, him not remembering me at all. It made me wonder how many people like him are out there, living completely different lives now, unaware of the impressions they left behind. Maybe that was just who he was back then, a man trapped in a blur, not fully there. Maybe he never saw me as a person, just a recurring shadow handing him a box of food, and now he'd sobered up, started fresh, and shed that entire part of his life like old skin. Still, part of me couldn't let it go, because I remembered him. I remembered the way he used to flinch when the drums stopped, like silence was scarier than chaos. I remembered the glazed look in his eyes, the smell of whiskey on his breath, the room always dim and quiet except for that frantic beat. And I remembered how I used to walk away feeling like I'd seen someone barely hanging on. He didn't recognize me, but I had witnessed something raw and unfiltered in him, something he might want to forget. Sometimes, the people we deliver to are more than addresses on a receipt. They're windows into lives unraveling in silence, and sometimes they stitch themselves back together without ever knowing you were there to see them at their worst. I hope Mike's doing better now. I hope he keeps that job, keeps showing up, keeps living in the daylight. He may never know the impact he left on a pizza delivery driver who once stepped over his unconscious body and waited for him to wake up. But I remember, and I hope forgetting was his first step toward healing. Story 8, 2 men at the park. It was my senior year of high school, and that morning started like many others. I woke up early, got dressed, and headed out to the small neighborhood park down the street, where I usually waited for the school bus. Most mornings there were other girls from the neighborhood there with me, chatting softly or listening to music. But that day was different. I was alone. The sky was clear, the air already warming up, and the usual crowd had yet to arrive. I sat down on the weathered bench near the curb, one earbud in, one ear free to listen to the world around me, a habit born from caution more than comfort. As I sat there, a black Honda pulled up across the street. The windows were tinted. At first, I tried not to pay attention. Maybe it was just someone waiting to pick someone else up. But minutes passed. Then two large men stepped out. Something about the way they moved, the way they looked around, too casually, too deliberately, set every instinct on edge. They didn't look lost or friendly. I immediately sent a message to my boyfriend, letting him know something felt off. When he didn't respond, I copied the message to my cousin, who lived nearby. Still nothing. They started walking toward me, slowly, purposefully. One of them spoke first, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked how old I was. I didn't respond. The second one just stared, arms folded, his expression unreadable. The first kept talking, asking if I had a boyfriend, if I lived nearby, if I liked to party. He offered me drugs, mentioned something about the black market. I felt a wave of cold panic wash over me, my hands trembling. I said no, trying to sound confident, but I felt like my voice might betray me. I lied and said my bus was coming soon. I didn't believe it myself, but it felt like the only thing I could cling to. As if summoned by that desperation, the bus appeared at the end of the street. Relief flooded my chest. The men backed off, but one of them quickly handed me a card, saying he ran a car dealership and could hook me up with something special for free. I didn't want to take it, but I knew I needed it. I needed that number. Evidence. I slipped it into my pocket, boarded the bus, and collapsed into a seat, shaking. The driver noticed something was wrong and gently asked me what happened. I broke down crying, the adrenaline finally unraveling inside me. She reassured me that I was safe now and kept the bus steady as we continued the route. At the school, she personally escorted me to the front office. The staff brought in a security officer and the principal, who listened carefully as I described everything, their appearance, what they said, how close they stood. When I handed them the business card, they exchanged a look I'll never forget. The principal picked up the office phone, called the number, and pretended to be my father. The man who answered had the same voice. As soon as the principal said the word daughter, the line went dead. Moments later, the number was disconnected entirely. It was then that the seriousness of it all truly settled in. The security officer called the police. They took down my statement and assured me that I had done the right thing. They told me these men had likely been watching the park, waiting for a moment when one of us was alone. That was the worst part, knowing that I had just been a variable in someone else's plan. That, if one small detail had been different, if the bus was late, if I had said yes, if I had frozen instead of moving, I might not have made it to school that morning. A week later, news came from another school nearby. A freshman girl had been attacked while waiting for her bus. Two men tried to drag her into a black Honda, but nearby students saw what was happening and intervened. She was saved. The suspects fled, but soon after, police apprehended them. When I was shown their photos, I didn't hesitate. I pointed them out immediately. It was them. The same two men. The ones who had tried to lure me. My stomach turned, knowing how close I had come to being in that girl's shoes, or worse. After that, my life changed in quiet but permanent ways. My family took turns driving me to school. My boyfriend, now an ex, made more of an effort to protect me for a while. But more than the changes around me, something deeper shifted inside. I stopped assuming that the world around me was safe just because it looked like home. I started listening more to that inner voice, the one that warns you before your brain catches up, the one that tells you something isn't right, even if you can't explain why. That voice saved me. never know what those men really intended to do. I never want to. But I know they saw me as an opportunity, a target, and I know that being cautious, keeping that one ear free, paying attention, trusting my instincts, might have been the reason I'm still here. I think about that bus driver often, about how calmly she sat with me while I cried, about the way she refused to let me walk into that school alone. Sometimes, the people who save you aren't the ones with badges or superpowers. Sometimes they're just someone doing their job with kindness, and in that moment, that's all you need to survive. Story 9. The final bus ride that wasn't mine. Back in the early 2000s, my friend Sarah was attending a local college in the city. She lived in the countryside with her father and used the bus system every day to get to school. She was used to it. Long rides, transfers, the occasional missed bus. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. One afternoon, after class, she and some friends gathered at a nearby apartment to study for exams. As often happens with college students, the study session quickly turned into a small party. Time passed unnoticed. Music played. Laughter filled the air. By the time Sarah looked at the clock, her heart sank. She had nearly missed the last bus of the night. Panicked, she threw on her jacket, grabbed her bag, and sprinted toward the bus stop, praying she wouldn't have to call her dad and explain why she was stranded in the city so late. Fortunately, she arrived just in time and hopped on, breathless with relief. The bus was nearly empty, save for a few tired riders. She sank into a seat at the back and put on her headphones, already thinking about the excuse she'd give her father when she got home. The city lights blurred past the windows as the bus rumbled through the quiet streets. She hadn't even noticed the small boy who sat down beside her until he leaned in slightly, watching her with an odd, fixed smile. The boy was dirty, his clothes wrinkled and stained, his hair unkempt. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, but there was something unnatural about his stillness. Sarah, trying to be polite, lowered her music and greeted him softly. "You're pretty," he said, his voice flat. She gave him a cautious smile, thanking him, unsure what to say. When she asked for his name, he replied, "Katie." That wasn't right. She hesitated, unsure if he was confused or just teasing. After a pause, he added, "You'd make a great mum," and without another word, walked to the front of the bus, joining a man Sarah hadn't noticed before. The man was filthy, even more so than the boy. His clothes were torn, his beard untrimmed, his face marked with grime, and yet he too was smiling, broad and vacant. He met Sarah's gaze and nodded slowly, never breaking the disturbing grin. Alarm bells rang in her mind. She turned in her seat, pulling out a book, trying to disappear into herself. But even without looking, she could feel their eyes on her. At every stop, she hoped they would get off, but they didn't. Riders came and went, and soon only 3 people remained: Sarah, the boy, and the man. As the bus entered a small town filled with fast food restaurants and flickering neon lights, Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. She would get off at the McDonald's and wait inside until her father could pick her up. But just as she gathered her things and stood up, she noticed the man also rising. Her heart dropped. Instead of exiting, she sat back down in a seat near the front. The man mirrored her again, settling in just a few rows back. Her instincts screamed. Something was terribly wrong. But she didn't want to panic or accuse anyone. Not yet. She leaned toward the driver and whispered her fears. "The man and the boy," she said softly. "I think they're following me." The driver looked in the rearview mirror, studied them briefly, and nodded. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll take care of it." Sarah's stop was the last on the route. 3 more stops to go. She texted her ex-boyfriend, someone she didn't trust with her heart anymore, but someone who had always come through in emergencies. He didn't hesitate. He was on his way. That gave her a small sense of peace. She kept her head down, waiting, praying. As the bus crested a hill and pulled into the final stop, the driver turned to Sarah and said he needed to talk to her about her pass. She understood immediately. This was part of the plan to keep her behind. The man rose, standing near the door, but the driver held up a hand. "Sir, this is the last stop. Please step off." The man hesitated. "I'm waiting for my daughter," he muttered. The driver's voice became firm. "She'll be along shortly. But you need to step off now." Reluctantly, the man exited, dragging the boy with him. As soon as the doors shut, he began banging on them, yelling incoherently. 2 police cars pulled into the station. Her ex arrived shortly after. The man outside tried to claim Sarah was his daughter, that he was just taking her home, but when asked what her name was, he said Katie. That was all the officers needed. He was arrested on the spot. Sarah sat inside the bus, trembling, trying to process what might have happened if she'd gotten off when he had. What if the driver hadn't believed her? What if her ex hadn't picked up the phone? What if she hadn't listened to her fear? Sarah never rode the bus again after that. Her father gave her the keys to an old car that sputtered and wheezed, but got her where she needed to go. She never forgot the kindness of that driver, the one who believed her without question. She brought him cookies a few weeks later, an unspoken thank you in sugar and chocolate. It didn't feel like enough, but it was what she could offer. Therapy helped her cope in the years that followed, but the memory never truly faded. Some stories don't end with tragedy, but they still carry the weight of what almost happened. They live in the quiet spaces of our minds, in the pauses before we sleep, in the moments we hesitate at a dark corner, in the sudden chill that creeps over our skin without reason. Sarah was lucky, not because she was strong, but because she was believed. Sometimes, survival is a thread held together by nothing more than a stranger's willingness to help, a driver who listens, and a single decision not to get off the bus. Story 10. The man behind the door. There was a period in my life when I lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 1-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by tall trees and the hum of distant traffic. I had just moved in after a difficult breakup, seeking solitude and peace. The complex was old but well kept, and I liked that most of my neighbors kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where you could disappear into your own little bubble without anyone asking too many questions, and that's exactly what I needed at the time. It was a rainy Thursday night, the kind where the sky feels low and heavy, pressing down on the world. I had just finished a late shift and returned home soaked to the bone, my shoes squishing with every step. I dried off, made some tea, and settled into bed, listening to the sound of the rain tapping gently on the windows. It wasn't long before I dozed off, comforted by the soft lullaby of the storm. But sometime around 2 a.m., I was pulled from sleep by a faint sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, just the rain or the creaks of an old building, but then I heard it again. A knock. Light. Deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart thudding in my chest. Another knock came, followed by the creak of floorboards just outside my front door. I held my breath, straining to hear through the walls. My apartment door had a frosted glass panel in the upper half, the kind that distorted figures into blurry shadows, and standing there, just beyond it, was a silhouette. A man. He didn't move. He didn't knock again. He just stood there, still and silent, his presence heavy against the fragile barrier between us. I stayed frozen in my bed, unsure whether to get up or pretend I wasn't home. Minutes passed. Then, slowly he leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against the glass. I couldn't see any details, just the shape of his head, the slope of his shoulders. I reached for my phone, trying not to make a sound. But when I turned it on, the screen was black. Dead. I hadn't charged it. Of course I hadn't. I cursed under my breath, then quietly slid out of bed and crept toward the kitchen where I kept my old landline phone. But when I picked it up, there was no dial tone. My power was still on. Lights, fridge, everything working. But the phone was silent. I peered through the peephole, which gave a clearer view than the frosted glass. The man was still there. But now he was smiling. Not a normal smile, something else. His lips were stretched too wide. His eyes opened just a little too far. He looked wrong, like a person pretending to be human, but not quite getting it right. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to do. Should I yell? Should I try to escape through the window? I decided to wait it out, to hide in the bathroom and lock the door. But just as I turned away, I heard a voice. "You dropped something," he said softly, as if speaking through the crack beneath the door. His tone was too calm, too deliberate. I hadn't dropped anything. I hadn't even opened the door. I stayed silent, hoping he would think I wasn't home. More minutes passed. Then came another whisper, this one lower, colder. "I see you." That was enough. I ran to the bathroom and locked the door. Grabbing the heaviest object I could find, I waited there for what felt like hours, listening for footsteps, for creaks, for the sound of the door being forced open, but nothing came. Eventually the sun began to rise, casting faint light into the hallway. I crept out, heart pounding, and peered through the peephole again. The man was gone. I opened the door just a crack and looked outside. Nothing. No footprints, no note, no sign that anyone had been there. But sitting just outside the door, placed neatly on the doormat, was a single glove, leather, black, dry, despite the rain. I picked it up with a towel and placed it in a bag, unsure what to do with it. I reported the incident to the apartment manager, who promised to review the security footage. The next day he told me there was no footage. The cameras had glitched out between 1:45 and 2:45 a.m., the exact time the man had been outside my door. The footage resumed normally afterward. No one believed me. There was no proof, no police report, no follow-up. I moved out a few weeks later, unable to sleep in that apartment anymore. The glove remained sealed in a box in my closet for years until one day it disappeared too. I never figured out where it went or who took it. To this day I don't know what the man wanted or why he came. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that sometimes you don't need a key or an open door to feel like something is already inside. That night changed the way I see shadows, how I listen to knocks, how I sleep with one ear open. Some visitors don't need an invitation. Some arrive on the quiet nights, hidden in rain, wrapped in silence, smiling through glass.